410,000. Let that number sink in for a moment. That is roughly the entire population of New Orleans. Louisiana gone. Killed, shattered, or permanently disabled. And that is just the count for one single year. In 2025, Vladimir Putin's military machine consumed over 410,000 of its own soldiers on the fields of eastern Ukraine. And in return for that unimaginable human cost, Russia seized less than 1.5% of Ukrainian territory. Less than 1.5%. But here's what they don't want you to know. There is now a secret deadline in play. A date. Circled in red, buried inside back-channel diplomatic cables, that could determine whether this war ends in a ceasefire or explodes into something none of us are prepared for. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you are going to understand exactly why Putin is bleeding his army dry, and exactly why he cannot stop. I'm Elize Harrison, and today we are going deep into the numbers that the Kremlin desperately does not want the Russian public to see. Let's start with the staggering reality of 2025. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most respected defense think tanks in Washington, Russian forces suffered approximately 415,000 casualties in 2025 alone. Killed, wounded, and missing. That averages out to nearly 35,000 Russian soldiers lost every single month. Every single month. To put that into historical perspective, the United States lost approximately 58,000 soldiers across the entire Vietnam War, which lasted over a decade. Russia is losing that equivalent roughly every 5 to 6 weeks. Now, some of you might be asking, Elize, how reliable are these numbers? And that is a fair question. The honest answer is military. Casualty data in active war zones is never perfectly precise. Russia classifies its losses as a state secret. Ukraine has incentive to inflate them. Western analysts work from satellite imagery, intercepted communications, open source data, and intelligence assessments. But here's the thing. When you have the US NATO Supreme Allied Commander, the UK Defense Ministry, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, The Economist, and Ukrainian battlefield data all converging on figures north of 400,000 casualties for 2025 alone, you are looking at something close to ground truth. The scale of the disaster is not in dispute. December 2025 was particularly catastrophic for Russian forces. According to data provided by Ukraine's General Staff, Russian troops were absorbing an average of 1,130 casualties per day in the last month of the year, an increase from November's already grim daily average of 1,030. The British Ministry of Defense assessed in its latest intelligence report that Russia is losing somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 troops per month, and explicitly warned that those casualty rates show nitrogen monoxide sign of decreasing in 2026. Let that sink in. As you're watching this video right now, Russian men are dying on the frozen plains of eastern Ukraine at a rate that shocks even seasoned military analysts. Now, here's the part that makes this story unlike any other war in modern history. After spending all those lives, after pouring all that blood into Ukrainian soil, how much of Ukraine does Russia actually control more than it did at the start of 2025? According to multiple datasets from the Institute for the Study of War, corroborated by Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi, Russia seized territory equivalent to roughly 0.8% of Ukraine's total landmass in 2025. CSIS puts the figure at approximately 4,831 square kilometers, or roughly 0.8% of Ukraine. Some estimates stretch slightly higher, to around 1.5% when factoring in all operational gains and retaken ground in KURSK. Less than 1.5%. For 410,000 men. Now stay with me here, because you might be thinking, okay, Russia is taking heavy losses, but it's still advancing. It's still winning on the ground, right? Stay right there, because the next number is going to completely reframe how you see this war. Here is a military fact that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. In the Pokrovsk offensive, Russia's primary, highest priority attack axis, in all of 2025, Russian forces advanced at an average rate of just 70 meters per day. 70 meters per day. That is less than the length of an American football field. Every 24 hours. For months on end. And to understand how grotesque that figure truly is, consider this. During the Battle of the Somme in World War I, one of the most brutal, murderous, and catastrophically inefficient offensives in all of human history, Allied forces still managed to advance an average of 80 meters per day. Russia's forces in Pokrovsk are advancing, slower than the armies that fought in the trenches of 1916. CSIS analysts compared Russia's offensive rates against some of the most famous military campaigns ever recorded. The Galicia offensive of 1914, which averaged 1,580 meters per day. The Soviet push at the Battle of Kursk-Oboyan in 1943, which averaged 3,220 meters per day. Even below Wood in 1980 averaged 410 meters per day. Russia in 2025 is not a peer to these campaigns. It is performing worse than some of the most notorious military disasters in modern history. And this is where it gets strategically crucial for you to understand. Russia has been fighting to capture the city of Pokrovsk, a city of 60,000 people with an area of roughly 23 square kilometers, for nearly 2 years. As of December 2025, the Institute for the Study of War assessed that Russian forces controlled approximately 67.6% of Pokrovsk. They still hadn't taken the full city. According to ASDU's analysis, it will take Russian forces at least another 2 to 3 years to seize the remainder of Ukrainian-controlled Donetsk Oblast. 2 to 3 more years. And that's just Donetsk. Meanwhile, to the south in Zaporizhia Oblast, a newer Russian offensive around Huliapol made slightly better progress, advancing roughly 18.5 kilometers between early November 2025 and early January 2026. Averaging 297 meters per day. That is faster than Pokrovsk, but still represents grinding, costly positional warfare, not the sweeping operational breakthroughs that Russian military doctrine was designed to achieve. But here's the question that's probably forming in your mind right now. If Russia is suffering these losses, why is Putin still doing this? Why doesn't he negotiate? Because the answer to that question leads us directly to the secret deadline. Before I get to that deadline, which you absolutely need to understand, because it is affecting every peace negotiation happening right now, I need to show you what the cost of this war is doing to Russia's ability to keep fighting at all. Because the manpower math is something the Kremlin is absolutely desperate to hide. Don't go anywhere. To understand why this war cannot go on indefinitely on Russia's current terms, you need to understand the arithmetic of what is happening to the Russian armed forces. At the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Russia committed an invasion force of approximately 190,000 troops. In the nearly 4 years since, most credible estimates from Western intelligence now place total Russian casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, at somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2 million personnel. That is 6 times Russia's original invasion force. Gone. Russia's ambassador to the UK, Andriy Kelin, told CNN in June 2025 that there were about 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine, down from 700,000 just a year earlier, and that Russia was recruiting and sending 50,000 to 60,000 new troops to Ukraine every single month just to maintain that number. Think about what that means operationally. Russia is not building up its forces. It is running on a treadmill, frantically replacing losses just to stay in the same position. British spy chief Richard Moore estimated approximately 1 million total Russian casualties, including roughly 240,000 killed in action. As of September 2025, the UK Ministry of Defence raised that estimate to approximately 1.118 million killed and wounded by October 2025, and CSIS, in its most detailed analysis, put total Russian battlefield fatalities, just killed, not wounded, between 275,000 and 325,000 through the end of 2025. To put those fatality numbers into historical context, Russia has now suffered roughly 5 times as many deaths in Ukraine as in every Russian and Soviet conflict combined between the end of World War II and February 2022. It is 15 times the death toll of the Soviet Union's entire decade-long war in Afghanistan. It is 10 times Russia's 13-year war in Chechnya. And The Economist published a detailed analysis in October 2025, based on satellite data and over 200 independent estimates from Western governments and researchers, that concluded Russia's total casualty toll had increased by 60% since just the start of 2025. Even if Ukraine's own death toll was double what open-source trackers have recorded, the ratio would still work out to roughly 5 Russian soldiers killed for every 1 Ukrainian. Now, Russia has compensated for these losses primarily through 2 mechanisms: prisoner recruitment, conscripting men from Russian prisons, and increasingly aggressive mobilization of men from the ethnic minority republics of Russia's interior, where the war is less politically sensitive. There have also been well-documented uses of North Korean troops on the front lines in 2024 and into 2025. But this strategy has hard limits. Russia's working-age male population is finite. Its economy is strained. Inflation remains stubbornly high through 2025. GDP growth slowed to just 0.6%. Consumer demand weakened. And the country faces a severe labor crunch, because so many men are either at the front, in prison, or dead. And this brings us to the most explosive element of this entire story, because the math is starting to catch up to Vladimir Putin. And there are people in Washington, in Brussels, and quietly in Moscow itself who believe there is now a hard window, a narrow, closing window, in which a deal to end this war is actually possible. And that window has a date attached to it. I'm going to give you that date right now. On February 8, 2026, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a stunning revelation to reporters. He disclosed that the United States, the Trump administration, has given both Russia and Ukraine a deadline. A hard deadline. June 22/6. According to Zelensky, who was speaking on the record, the Americans are pushing for both parties to reach a deal to end the war by the beginning of this summer. The Americans are proposing the parties end the war by the beginning of this summer, and will probably put pressure on the parties precisely according to this schedule. Zelensky said directly, "This is not a rumor. This is not a leak. This is the president of Ukraine, speaking to reporters, telling the world that a deadline exists, and that if it is not met, the Trump administration will apply pressure to both sides to force compliance." Now, why June? What happens in June that makes it so significant? Several things converge at that moment. First, the warmer summer months historically reduce certain tactical advantages Ukraine holds through the muddy and frozen terrain of winter. Second, the Trump administration's diplomatic calendar is increasingly focused on domestic economic priorities, and sustaining political will for Ukrainian engagement has limits within Washington's attention span. Third, and perhaps most critically, the New START nuclear arms control treaty expired on February 4, 2026. With nuclear architecture collapsing between the United States and Russia, there is an urgent strategic reason for Washington to want a stable framework in place in Europe sooner rather than later. The 28-point US peace framework that was circulating in late 2025, drafted largely by Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, called for an immediate ceasefire and proposed that Russia retain de facto control of territory it currently occupies in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, while Ukraine would formally cede approximately 2,500 square miles of Donetsk province that Russia has not yet captured, in exchange for roughly 700 square miles of territory near Kharkiv. Russia would gain a net of approximately 1,800 square miles under this framework. That plan has not been accepted. Putin, speaking ahead of a visit to New Delhi in December 2025, acknowledged the Witkoff-brokered discussions, calling them necessary and useful, but said there were points he cannot agree to. Critically, Putin also publicly stated in June 2025 that all of Ukraine is ours, making clear his maximalist position has not changed, even as he sends envoys to negotiating tables. On the Ukrainian side, Zelensky has been equally firm. He told reporters that we stand where we stand on the territorial question of Donbass, refusing to accept any framework that requires Ukraine to surrender lands Russia has not yet fully seized. He has expressed deep skepticism toward a U.S. proposal to turn the Donbass region into a free economic zone, as some form of compromise. I do not know whether this can be implemented, he said. And then there was the extraordinary scene at the end of January 2026, when Trump announced, from a cabinet meeting at the White House, that he had personally called Putin and asked him not to bomb Ukrainian cities for a week due to the extreme cold Ukraine was experiencing. The Kremlin's Dmitry Peskov confirmed that Putin had agreed to a personal request from Trump to pause strikes on Kyiv until February 1st, a deeply confused situation that had different Russian state news agencies reporting contradictory things, Ukrainian officials saying there was no official ceasefire agreement, and Trump framing it as a major diplomatic win. Russia's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev, Harvard-educated, English-speaking, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund and Moscow's primary negotiator in peace talks, reportedly presented the Trump administration with a jaw-dropping $12 trillion economic cooperation proposal that Zelensky dismissed as fantastical. For reference, Russia's entire GDP in 2025 was approximately $2.3 trillion. The proposal appears designed to entice the transactional wing of the Trump White House with promises of post-war economic partnership. Pipe dream numbers meant to keep Washington engaged with Moscow rather than squeezing it. But Washington is not the only player in this drama. Europe is scrambling to shape whatever deal emerges, and what they are planning is far more aggressive than most people realize. Because while the US and Russia are negotiating directly, often completely cutting out Kyiv and European capitals, the UK and France have quietly drawn up a contingency plan that would fundamentally change NATO's posture on the European continent. And it involves putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. Stay with me. This is where the stakes go truly global. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron have been quietly developing what they're calling a post-ceasefire security architecture for Ukraine. The core of that architecture, military hubs, according to reporting confirmed by multiple Western sources. In the event of a ceasefire, the United Kingdom and France are prepared to establish military hubs across Ukrainian territory, protected facilities for weapons, military equipment, and forward deployed forces that would function as a deterrent against any future Russian offensive. Starmer stated openly that the UK and France will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs. This plan was discussed at a Paris summit in early January 2026, where European nations aligned around 5 key priorities: monitoring mechanisms for any ceasefire, continued support for Ukraine's armed forces, multinational force deployment on land, sea, and in the air, deterrence commitments in case of renewed Russian aggression, and long-term defense cooperation with Kyiv. But there is a fundamental problem. Vladimir Putin has drawn an absolute red line. He will not accept any deployment of NATO country troops on Ukrainian soil. Full stop. He has said so repeatedly and unambiguously. Which means the European contingency plan, as currently structured, is a non-starter for Russia in any negotiated peace framework. Meanwhile, Macron flew to Beijing in early February 2026 to meet with Xi Jinping, explicitly seeking China's involvement in pressuring Russia toward a ceasefire. She did not publicly commit. He responded that China supports all efforts that work towards peace, which is the diplomatic equivalent of saying absolutely nothing. China has been providing strong diplomatic support for Putin throughout the war and has no visible incentive to suddenly pivot against Moscow. And here is the geopolitical chessboard as it currently stands. The US wants a deal by June. Russia wants to keep fighting because it is slowly winning territory, even at catastrophic cost, but cannot afford to completely alienate the Trump administration, which represents its best chance of avoiding additional crippling sanctions. Ukraine wants to fight, but faces severe manpower shortages, resource constraints, and growing domestic political pressures. Europe wants security guarantees, but is not in the room where the real decisions are being made. And China is watching, waiting and calculating. There is no clear path to a deal by June, but there is a very clear path to dangerous escalation. If one isn't reached. And now comes the question that I know is sitting in the back of your mind. If Russia is losing 35,000 men a month and has only gained 1.5% of Ukraine's territory, why doesn't Putin just negotiate? What is he actually calculating? The answer is more disturbing than you might expect, and it tells you everything about what comes next. Don't go anywhere. This is the most important question in geopolitics right now. Why does Vladimir Putin continue a war that is costing Russia 35,000 men every month for gains that amount to a rounding error on a map? The answer is not irrational. It is, in its own terrible logic, completely consistent. First, Putin believes Russia is winning, and he is not entirely wrong. Yes, the casualty rates are catastrophic, but Russia is still advancing. It is slowly, expensively, grinding forward across Donetsk. It captured Seversk after 41 months of fighting. It controls over 2/3 of Pokrovsk. It is making gains in Zaporizhia. On a long enough timeline, and the Kremlin's planning horizon operates in years, not months, Russia calculates that Ukrainian resistance will eventually fracture under the weight of casualties, manpower exhaustion, and Western fatigue. Second, stopping would be politically devastating for Putin domestically. The Russian information environment has convinced the Russian public that this is an existential conflict, a battle against NATO aggression, against Western attempts to destroy the Russian state. Accepting a ceasefire at the current lines, after nearly 4 years of war and over 1 million casualties, without having achieved stated objectives like the so-called denazification of Ukraine or Ukrainian neutrality, would be humiliating. And humiliation has historically been lethal to Russian leaders. Third, Putin has a negotiating position that is actually quite strong with the Trump administration. He has something Trump wants: an end to the war. He is using that leverage, deliberately, slowly, extracting maximum concessions from Washington while his forces grind forward on the ground. Every week he delays, his forces gain another few square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Every week he delays, the diplomatic pressure on Ukraine to accept worse terms increases. The ISW assessed bluntly in late December 2025 that the culture of false reporting within the Russian military is pervasive. Russian commanders routinely provide inflated reports to Moscow about battlefield successes. ISW concluded that any sudden Russian operational level breakthrough remains unlikely. But that matters less to Putin than the steady accumulation of terrain, the steady erosion of Ukrainian morale, and the steady pressure on Washington to force Kyiv to the negotiating table on Russian terms. And the final piece of this equation, the piece that makes the June deadline so genuinely dangerous, is this: if no deal is reached by summer 2026, the Trump administration faces a binary choice. Either escalate pressure on Russia, which could mean additional sanctions, additional weapons shipments to Ukraine, or actions that bring the United States into more direct confrontation with Moscow, or walk away from Ukraine entirely, leaving Kyiv to face Russia alone. Both options carry catastrophic risks. Neither is politically clean or easy. According to CSIS, Russia has not produced a single company in the top 100 global technology firms by market capitalization. Its economy grew by just 0.6% in 2025. Its manufacturing sector is declining. It is falling further and further behind in artificial intelligence and advanced technology. The long-term trajectory for Russia is a steadily weakening economic and technological position relative to the West and to China. But in the short term, through 2026 and possibly 2027, Russia has enough men, enough artillery shells, enough battlefield momentum to keep fighting. And Vladimir Putin knows that. He is betting that your attention runs out before his ammunition does. So where does this go from here? Let me give you the 3 scenarios that serious analysts are modeling right now, because understanding these scenarios is the difference between being someone who just watches events unfold, and someone who actually understands the logic driving them. Scenario 1. The June deal. The Trump administration manages to broker a ceasefire framework by early summer 2026. Ukraine accepts a frozen conflict. Russian forces hold their current positions. A demilitarized buffer zone is established and European forces eventually deploy along the ceasefire line as a peacekeeping presence. This is the optimistic scenario. The problem is that it requires Putin to stop advancing voluntarily before he has to. And it requires Ukraine to cede territory that Zelensky has sworn publicly he will never cede. Most analysts currently assess this scenario as low probability. Scenario 2. The grinding stalemate continues. No deal is reached by June. The Trump administration quietly deprioritizes Ukraine as domestic issues dominate the political calendar. European allies increase support but cannot fully compensate for reduced American engagement. The war continues. At its current horrifying pace, minus 35,000 Russian casualties per month, slow Russian advances, Ukrainian resistance sustained, but increasingly strained, into 2027 and potentially well beyond. This is currently the most likely scenario according to battlefield and diplomatic trajectories. Costly, bloody, unresolved, and deeply dangerous for the stability of the entire European continent. Scenario 3. Ukrainian collapse or Russian escalation. If Ukrainian forces suffer a catastrophic breakthrough, if Pokrovsk falls and triggers a cascade collapse of defensive lines in Donetsk, or if Russia deploys additional unconventional tools in response to a stalled negotiation process, the conflict could enter a dangerous new phase that none of the current frameworks are designed to handle. This is the scenario that keeps NATO planners awake at night. It is not the most likely outcome, but it is not a remote one either, and the probability grows with every month that passes without a deal. Here is the bottom line that I want you to take away from today's video. In 2025, Vladimir Putin sacrificed over 410,000 Russian soldiers, husbands, sons, fathers, brothers to gain less than 1.5% of Ukrainian territory. He advanced slower than armies moved through the blood-soaked trenches of World War I. He has spent nearly 4 years and over 1 million total casualties and does not yet control all of Donetsk Oblast, let alone Ukraine. And yet, he is still advancing. And he has a deadline now working against both sides. A June 2026 window set by the Trump administration that could either produce an imperfect, painful peace, or trigger a dangerous escalation when it expires without a deal in place. The numbers are obscene. The diplomacy is fragile. The stakes are civilizational. And the world is watching. I want to hear your take on this. And here is a specific question I want you to answer in the comments right now. Do you think Putin will accept a ceasefire deal before June 2026? Or do you believe he will keep fighting until one side completely collapses? Drop your analysis below. Tell me which scenario you think is most likely and why. I read every single comment on this channel, and I genuinely want to know where you see this going, because this community has some of the sharpest geopolitical minds on YouTube. And the conversation in the comments is always worth reading. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground and at the negotiating table, please hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm that this kind of serious data-driven analysis matters. And it helps us reach more people who want to understand the world rather than just be scared by it. And if you are not yet subscribed to GeoStrategiv, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a breakdown like this one. We cover the biggest geopolitical stories on the planet every single day, so you always understand what's really happening and why it matters to you personally. I'm Elize Harrison. Stay alert, stay informed, and I will see you in the next video.